We can get 3 fresh grads for what we pay you, he said with a smirk. Nothing personal, just a budget call. My name is Ethan Ward. I'm 57. And until this morning, I was the principal systems architect at Core Developments, a commercial real estate firm based in Seattle. For over 19 years, I built everything they relied on, layer by layer, system by system. And just like that, it was over. Across the table sat Logan Pierce, the new CTO, all slick hair and startup energy. Barely 40, fresh from Silicon Valley, full of plans to modernize things by letting go of the people who actually knew how it all worked. Beside him, Jenna from HR slid a manila envelope my way. You'll find the severance details inside, 8 weeks salary and unused PTO. We really appreciate your contributions, Ethan. I picked it up, nodded. Thanks. Logan looked almost annoyed. That's it? No questions? No feedback? What would you like me to say? I asked, staring at the branded coffee mug I wouldn't be taking with me. You've made your decision. They didn't understand. I wasn't calm. I was finished. There's a difference. As I packed my things, one cardboard box was enough. 19 years, one box. I walked past a few familiar desks. Nobody made eye contact. They already knew. When they let go of the guy who kept the whole system running, nobody was safe. Down in the parking garage, my phone buzzed. A text from Riley, one of the junior engineers I mentored years ago. Ethan, they're freaking out. The ops team doesn't even know where to start. I didn't reply. I just sat in my car, staring at the rain-speckled windshield, hands tight on the steering wheel. Whatever comes next, it'll be on my terms. And if this story hits close to home, maybe you've been there too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who's rebuilding. You're not alone. Back home, I sat alone on the deck, overlooking the Puget Sound. The water shimmered beneath a fading sun, and the wind carried the scent of pine from the hills. I had poured myself a glass of bourbon, the kind I usually saved for celebrating milestones. Today didn't feel like one. Elaine stepped out, silent at first, then placed her hand gently on my shoulder. What now? She asked, her voice soft but steady. I stared out at the horizon. I don't know. Something always turns up. What Logan didn't know, what he didn't care to learn, was that I hadn't just managed the systems. I had written the backbone of it all. Custom code, layered security, hidden redundancies that kept everything running even when it shouldn't have. No user manual, no off-the-shelf equivalent, because every time I asked for a documentation team, they said it wasn't in the budget. Maybe next quarter, they told me. That quarter never came. Only I knew where the fail-safes were buried. Only I could trace how the payment processing looped through internal verifications before syncing with external databases. And I wasn't planning to explain it now. I didn't sabotage them. I simply built something so strong and complex that forgetting its architect was their first mistake. I joined Core back when it was still called Rainview Properties, a small firm managing a handful of low-rise buildings around Tacoma. Their IT department was 2 ancient desktops, a fax machine, and a dusty DSL modem tucked behind the office printer. Harold Jameson, the founder, hired me away from a short-term consulting contract. We're about to grow, he said, shaking my hand with the kind of conviction you don't forget. I need someone who can build something real. So I did. Over the next 19 years, I designed and built a custom system that grew as they did. First a tenant management interface, then online applications, background checks, digital lease signing, and eventually a full operations suite. It wasn't flashy, but it was airtight. Every function was intentional. Every line of code earned its place. I learned to adapt quickly. When budgets were tight, I found workarounds. When features were requested last minute, I stayed late. By the time Harold retired and his son Jared sold the company to a private equity firm, we had over 60 properties across 4 states and a system running nearly everything on the back end. They rebranded as Mira Core. I stayed on, quietly, steadily, because what I'd built still mattered. Or so I thought.
The changes came slowly at first, small things I brushed off. A rejected proposal for a system audit, a postponed discussion about training junior staff. Then the shift became clearer. They stopped approving tool upgrades. My requests for documentation support were shelved again and again. Let's revisit that next quarter, they'd say. But that quarter never came. Instead, they brought in consultants, young, sharp, polished. They spoke in buzzwords: disruption, agile reinvention, cloud native. They sat through my system walkthroughs, nodding politely, but their eyes glazed over by the third slide. Then came their reports, recommendations for pre-built solutions that had no chance of integrating with what I had custom built. I pushed back, calmly, professionally. I showed them exactly why their suggestions wouldn't work. Eventually, I stopped getting invites to those meetings. Elaine noticed it before I did. Over dinner one evening, she set her fork down and said, "They're phasing you out, Ethan. You need to be ready." I shook my head. "They can't. No one else understands the system like I do." She gave me a look, not unkind, just knowing. "Exactly," she said. 6 months before they let me go, they brought in Logan Pierce, new CTO, clean resume, banking software background, all about optimization, efficiency, and buzzword-driven overhauls. He moved fast. Within weeks, he hired 3 junior engineers, fresh out of college, eager, and completely unprepared for the depth of Miracor's custom infrastructure. They started shadowing me, notebooks in hand, asking basic questions about the system I'd spent nearly 2 decades refining. I answered what I could, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't get it. Not the why, not the how. Because how could they? You don't reverse engineer 2 decades of layered redundancies, hand-tuned protocols, and silent safeguards in a few weeks, especially when none of it was documented properly, because documentation was always too expensive. I knew what was coming, and still, when Logan popped his head into my office one afternoon and said, "Hey, quick check-in tomorrow morning, just a quarterly thing," I nodded, not suspecting. But I should have. That wasn't a check-in. That was the ambush. 2 weeks after the meeting where they cut me loose, I was in my home office polishing my resume when my phone lit up. Logan Pierce. I let it ring. His voice landed in my voicemail. "Ethan, we're running into some issues with the tenant dashboard. The junior team's trying to sort it out, but they're having trouble understanding the system logic. Just a quick consultation?" I deleted the message. 3 more calls came that afternoon, each voicemail more urgent. By nightfall, I got a text from Riley, the same junior engineer who'd shadowed me weeks ago. "System's been down since noon. Maintenance requests are stuck. Logan's panicking." I still didn't answer. The next morning, Jenna from HR called. She was trying her best to sound casual. "Ethan, we'd like to discuss a short-term consulting arrangement. Of course, compensation would reflect the urgency." I picked up finally. "How much?" "300 an hour, minimum 4-hour engagements." "I'll think about it," I said, then hung up. Elaine placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of me. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I stared out at the water. "I think they're starting to realize what I was actually worth." Over the next 3 days, the calls didn't stop. Logan, Jenna, even Jared Jameson, the former owner's son who still sat on the board, all reaching out. The system hadn't just glitched, it had unraveled. The tenant portal was offline. Maintenance scheduling threw constant errors. Automatic rent payments weren't processing. Thousands of transactions hanging in limbo. I remained silent. On the 4th evening, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Logan standing there, disheveled and visibly shaken. His designer glasses were slightly crooked, his suit wrinkled in a way that betrayed how little sleep he'd had. "Ethan," he began, voice tight, "I'm sorry to drop by like this, but we're in crisis. Nothing's working. The team can't trace the root of the failure, and the board is breathing down my neck." I leaned casually against the doorframe. "That sounds serious." "It is," he admitted. "We need your help. I've been authorized to offer you $500 an hour. Unlimited hours. Whatever it takes." I thought about the cardboard box still sitting in the garage. Thought about 19 years of service erased with a cost-cutting smirk. "I have an interview tomorrow," I said simply. "I think something better is turning up." And then I closed the door. Slowly. Quietly. Finally. The next morning, I met Lawrence Tran, Director of Technology at North Haven Systems, at a quiet cafe in downtown Seattle. He was already waiting, a tablet on the table, and a calm, measured smile on his face. "I've followed your work for years," he said, offering a firm handshake. "That property management system you built at Miracore? It's become something of a benchmark." "Appreciate that," I replied. "Took a long time to get it right." "That's exactly why I'm here," Lawrence continued. "We're growing fast, and we don't want to piece together patchwork solutions. We want something solid, something lasting, and we want you to build it." I studied him for a moment, then asked what had to be asked. "Why me?" "There are plenty of younger engineers out there, cheaper ones." Lawrence chuckled. "We tried that. Got a pretty UI that buckles under real traffic. We don't want cheap. We want reliable." Then he slid a folder across the table. "Chief Systems Architect, full benefits, stock options, a salary 20% higher than what Miracore had paid." It was a good offer. Too good to be rushed. But in that moment, I didn't hesitate. "I'm in," I said. And for the first time in weeks, I meant it. While I settled into my new role at North Haven, Miracore's troubles only deepened. Riley sent me occasional updates through short, tense texts. Systems still unstable. Consultants brought in. They're rewriting modules and making it worse. Then came the inevitable call from Logan. I let it go to voicemail. "Ethan, please, it's getting serious. We've lost access to 3 months of payment data. Residents are complaining about false charges. The consultants say they can't move forward without your input on the database schema." I stared at the phone in my hand. The old me might have answered, out of loyalty, out of pride, but not now. Still, something made me pick up when he called again the next day. "Logan," I said, my voice even, "I'm under exclusive contract now. I can't help you." "We'll double what they're paying, just 2 days. That's all we're asking." "It's not about money." "Then what is it?" he snapped. "Revenge?" I paused, let the silence speak for itself, then replied quietly, "No. It's about decisions. You decided I wasn't worth the cost. Now you're discovering what that truly meant." He didn't respond, and I didn't need him to. Logan's voice changed after that, less confident, more strained. "The board wants to bring you back," he said in his next voicemail. "Full salary, signing bonus, whatever it takes." For a moment, I felt something, satisfaction maybe, vindication, but it faded quickly. Going back wouldn't fix anything. The same board that deemed me expendable would still be there, waiting for another excuse to cut corners. When I didn't reply, Logan called again, this time with a sharper tone. "You know we could pursue legal options, Ethan. If it turns out you deliberately made the system hard to maintain, there could be consequences. Intellectual property, non-compete issues." There it was, the threat. I spoke slowly, clearly. Every line of code was written under contract. Every component belongs to Miracore. I took nothing, except my knowledge. And as for maintenance, I asked for documentation support for years. You all said no. Silence on the line. "You're welcome to have your lawyers call mine," I added, then hung up. My hands were steady. But beneath the surface, something burned. Anger I hadn't let myself feel until now. They didn't just discard me. They accused me of sabotage, of weaponizing my own work. That was unforgivable. At North Haven, I was building something different, something clean. We started from scratch, but this time with intention. Every line of code was documented. Every system had backups. I trained my team personally, not just on how things worked, but why they were built that way. No single points of failure. No secrets buried deep in undocumented loops. No one left guessing. It was slow, deliberate work. The kind that never gets flashy headlines, but keeps entire companies standing when the unexpected hits. 2 weeks in, Alan, my old database admin from Miracore, showed up at my office with a lunch bag and a tired smile. "Got time?" he asked. Over sandwiches at a nearby park, he gave me the full picture. "It's worse than you think," he said, glancing around before lowering his voice. "They've lost access to historical data going back 3 years. Backup protocols weren't followed. The consultants are scrambling. They might have to rebuild everything from the ground up." I wasn't shocked. I knew how fragile the system was when used incorrectly. "Logan didn't just botch the handoff," Alan continued. "He planned it. Months ago. I found emails. He pitched your removal as a cost-saving measure, promised the board $1 million in yearly savings." I looked out over the water. My jaw tightened. So it had never been about modernization. It was always a setup.
Alan wasn't finished. He pulled out his laptop, eyes flicking around the deli before opening a folder. Here, he said, tilting the screen toward me. Board emails, internal planning documents, all of it. There it was in black and white. Logan outlining the so-called legacy staff reduction plan, with my name right at the top. He sold them on the idea that my systems were too complex, too costly to maintain. That 3 junior engineers and a few plug-and-play solutions would be more scalable. He projected $1 million in savings. I scrolled in silence. One sentence stuck with me like a splinter. Ward's made himself indispensable by design, not necessity. I closed the laptop. My chest felt hollow. Alan leaned forward. That's not all. The equity firm backing Miracore, they've been prepping for a sale. This whole thing, cutting staff, slashing investment. It was about inflating margins, not building anything real. It all clicked into place. The sudden budget freezes, the resistance to training, the hiring of flashover substance consultants. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Alan shrugged. Because I quit last week. Half the IT team's gone, and I was hoping North Haven might be hiring. I smiled, for the first time that day. We might be. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner with Elaine, my phone rang again. Logan. Voice had lost all pretense of authority. Ethan, please, this is critical. West Pine Residential is threatening to terminate their contract. That's nearly 1/3 of our revenue. The board is panicking. They're questioning everything. I stayed silent. We need you. Just name your price. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the lights flickering across the sound. It's not about price, I said calmly. It's about respect. For the work, for the people behind it. You never valued that. There was a pause on the line, then his voice dropped lower. You knew this would happen. You knew exactly what would break and when. I exhaled slowly. No, Logan. I just knew what I'd built, and how much care it required. I tried to share that with you. You didn't want to listen. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was final. I ended the call without another word. No anger, no satisfaction, just certainty. Some lessons don't come through explanation. They come through failure. 2 months into my role at North Haven, Lawrence called me into his office. There was a spark in his tone I hadn't heard before. I just got off the phone with Jeffrey Sloan, CEO of West Pine Residential, he said. They're officially terminating their contract with Miracore next month. I leaned forward, the weight of that statement settling in. They want to know if we can take over their portfolio. West Pine managed over 10,000 units across the Northwest. It would more than double North Haven's operational scale. We're not ready, I admitted. The new system is strong, but we're only halfway through the architecture. What would it take to be ready in time? I didn't answer right away. I sat with it, thought about the infrastructure, the engineering hours, the testing cycles. 3 more senior engineers, I said finally. Dedicated servers. 8 weeks of development, minimum. It's tight, but doable. Lawrence nodded. Jeffrey's desperate. He's willing to fund the infrastructure and give us 12 weeks. This was it. The pivot point. The moment that could define everything we were building. Let me draw up a plan, I told him. I'll have something on your desk by morning. And just like that, the next chapter began. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with diagrams and dependencies, failure points and fallback plans. By dawn, my dining table was covered in sketches, modular system layouts, phased migration strategies, scalable server models. I brought the plan to Lawrence just after 8. He studied it in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. This is solid, he said finally. But I noticed you've added a documentation phase that spans 3 weeks. That's a significant portion of the timeline. It's non-negotiable, I replied. That's where Miracore failed. We document everything. We trained the team on every module. No silos, no black boxes, no shortcuts. Lawrence nodded. You've got full backing. The next few weeks were the most intense of my career. We brought in 5 additional engineers, 2 of them former MiraCore staff who had walked out after the collapse. Alan led the database migration efforts, building a custom tool to translate MiraCore's legacy structure into our new environment. I oversaw system integration, ensuring each module could scale independently but work in seamless unison. It wasn't just about meeting the deadline. It was about proving, quietly, precisely, that systems built with care, collaboration, and respect don't fall apart when pressure hits. They endure. 10 weeks into our 12-week timeline, we were ready for the first stage. West Pine's western region, 2,000 units across Washington, would be the pilot. If the migration went smoothly, the rest would follow in waves. The day before the rollout, Lawrence called me into the conference room. A familiar face was already there. Jeffrey Sloan, sharp suit, calm demeanor. He stood to shake my hand. "So, you're the architect," he said. "Lawrence speaks highly of you." "I hope it's all true," I replied with a faint smile. He nodded. "We're looking for more than a fix. We need a foundation, something that won't break every time we scale. From what I hear, you've built just that." I gave a modest nod. "That's the goal." Then his tone shifted. "You used to work for MiraCore, right?" I hesitated, then confirmed. "They're in bad shape. Their system's still unstable. And now that we're leaving, the equity firm behind them is looking to sell. But no one's biting." He paused. "Except one." Lawrence leaned forward. "We're considering an acquisition, at a steep discount." The room fell silent. "If we move forward," Jeffrey continued, "we'll need someone who knows both systems. Someone who can lead the integration." I looked at them both. "I'm open to it," I said slowly. "But on one condition, this time, we do it right." "No shortcuts," Lawrence agreed. "We've learned that lesson." 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of what used to be MiraCore's headquarters. The sign had changed. It now read, North Haven Integrated Property Systems. The acquisition had gone through for less than a quarter of MiraCore's peak valuation. Lawrence and I walked the halls together, greeting familiar faces. Some employees looked away, awkwardly. Others smiled, relieved, maybe even grateful. A few of the old engineers, those who had once sat beside me through long nights of server rebuilds and silent code reviews, nodded with quiet recognition. Logan Pierce was gone. So was most of the executive team that had signed off on my termination. Jared Jameson remained, now as a transitional consultant. He didn't say much, but the weight in his posture told me everything. When we passed the old server room, Lawrence stopped. "Want to go in?" he asked. I looked through the glass. I could still see the racks I'd spec'd, the blinking lights of systems I'd once tuned by hand. "No need," I said. "We'll be migrating everything soon anyway." In the main conference room, the remaining MiraCore staff gathered. Lawrence introduced me. "This is Ethan Ward. Many of you already know him. He built the systems that carried this company for nearly 2 decades. Now, he's here to help us build something better." As I looked around the room, I felt no urge to gloat. Only the quiet responsibility of doing the work, this time, the right way. 1 year after the acquisition, North Haven had become the largest property systems provider in the region. The full migration was complete. Every former MiraCore property now ran on the system my team and I had built, modular, resilient, and fully documented. That morning, as leaves along the Puget Sound shifted into deep reds and golds, I drove into the office for a final meeting with Lawrence. "The board approved it," he said as I sat down. "The technical education division launches next quarter. Full autonomy. Budget's in place." I exhaled, not from exhaustion, but something more settled. fulfillment. This was the condition I'd set for staying on after the integration. Not a bigger title, not a corner office, a program to train the next generation. Engineers who wouldn't just learn to write code, but to build systems that could last. "Thank you," I said. "No," Lawrence replied. "Thank you. You didn't just fix a broken system, you changed how we think about building one." That afternoon, I packed up my integration office. Unlike my exit from Miracore, this one was calm, chosen, complete. And as I carried the last box to my car, I didn't feel pride or triumph, just purpose. As I was locking up, Jared Jameson appeared in the hallway, a hesitant look on his face. "Got a minute?" he asked. We walked out to the courtyard, quiet except for the rustle of fall leaves. "My father's been asking about you," he said. "He's retired now, down in Arizona. But he still keeps up with industry news. Said he was glad to hear you were back." "In a manner of speaking," I replied. Jared nodded, his hands in his coat pockets. "You know, he always told me that letting you go would be the biggest mistake this company could make." I didn't know how to respond to that. "I learned something through all of this," Jared continued. "Value isn't always visible. Sometimes you don't realize what's holding the structure together until it's already gone." We stood there for a long moment. The silence not awkward this time, just honest. As I drove home along the water's edge, the afternoon sun casting gold across the shoreline, I thought about everything we'd built, and everything that had to break before the rebuilding could begin. I hadn't chased revenge. I hadn't needed to. I just did the work, built something better, and let the results speak for themselves. That evening, I sat with Elaine on the back deck, the sky stretched in hues of lavender and ember over the Sound. She didn't say much. She never needed to. Just reached over and handed me a mug of tea, her quiet way of asking, "How are you really?" I stared out at the water, the reflection of the fading sun rippling gently against the shore. "I think I finally understand," I said. Elaine waited. "All those years, I thought loyalty would protect me. That doing the work right, keeping the ship steady, would mean something to the people steering it." I paused. "But sometimes, they don't see what's keeping them afloat until it's gone." She rested her head against my shoulder. "You didn't lose anything," she said softly. "You took all of it with you. The knowledge, the patience, the integrity, and you built something they never could." I let the silence settle. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving what I already knew to be true. What mattered wasn't being irreplaceable. It was building something that shouldn't be replaced. Not because of ego, but because it was made to last. A week later, the training center opened its doors. A modest space inside the North Haven campus, outfitted with whiteboards, test servers, and coffee that actually tasted decent. I stepped inside that morning to find a dozen young engineers waiting, notebooks open, eyes alert, not with fear, but curiosity. I introduced myself simply. "I'm Ethan Ward. I'll be teaching you not just how to build systems, but how to build resilient ones, the kind that won't crumble the first time a deadline gets tight or a manager says, 'Just ship it.'" Their attention didn't waver. I wrote the word integrity on the board. "This isn't about heroics," I said. "It's about care, about building systems that respect the people who'll have to maintain them long after we've logged off." As the session went on, I saw the same spark I used to feel. Back when it was just me, 2 towers, and a dial-up modem in a tiny back office. Except now, I wasn't building alone. I was passing it on. And somehow, that mattered even more. As weeks passed, the training program found its rhythm. Every session brought new questions, sharper thinking, and, slowly, confidence. One afternoon, while reviewing architecture diagrams with a small group, I noticed something that gave me pause. One of the students, Lena, had annotated a module I'd built over a decade ago and spotted a flaw I had missed back then. A rare one. Edge case, but still real. She explained it carefully, respectfully. I listened, then smiled. Good catch, I said. That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps systems alive. The others leaned in, energized. In that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just a second chance for me. It was a clean start for all of us. No legacy baggage, no power plays, just shared knowledge and the collective goal of building smarter. Later that day, Alan stopped by my office. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching the class through the glass wall. You know, he said, this might be your best system yet. I glanced back at the room. Maybe, I replied. Because this one doesn't run on servers. It runs on people. The hallway outside the training center buzzed with quiet energy. Whiteboards half erased, coffee cups half full, young engineers filing out in 2s and 3s, still discussing packet integrity and failover logic. I lingered by the door, gathering my notes, when someone called out from behind. Ethan Ward? I turned. She was taller than I remembered, more poised, but her eyes were unmistakable, curious, sharp, thoughtful. Naomi Briggs, she said, extending her hand. I don't expect you to remember me. Internship class of 2014. You used to give us pop quizzes on server naming conventions just to see who was paying attention. I laughed, a memory surfacing. Late afternoons in the old Miracore break room, Naomi furiously scribbling answers on the back of a napkin. I remember, I said. You were the only one who figured out why we skipped rack ID 13. She smiled. Still superstitious. Still methodical. We walked together toward the glass atrium at the end of the hall. Sunlight poured in through high windows. So, what brings you back? I asked. I'm leading the new systems team at Redbridge Analytics, she said. We're scaling fast. I came to observe your training model, honestly, to see if what I remembered about you still holds up. And does it? It does, she replied, her voice quieter now. You didn't just teach me how to code. You taught me how to think, how to see the whole picture. I didn't get it back then, not really. But I do now. I looked at her, genuinely moved. You're doing good work, Naomi. I'm proud of you. She paused, then added, You know, back when you got let go, a lot of us didn't understand it. We thought, if he's replaceable, what chance do we have? And now? She looked around. At the center, the diagram still sketched on glass, the quiet hum of people building something that would last. Now we know better. She handed me her card. If you ever want to collaborate, training, system audits, anything, we'd be lucky to have your insight. After she left, I stood alone in the atrium. The light had shifted. The space felt fuller. Legacy isn't a title or line in a resume. It's the people who walk back through your door, not because they have to, but because they want to. And sometimes, that's the clearest proof that the work mattered. One quiet evening, long after the building had emptied, I stayed behind to finalize curriculum updates. The office was still, just the hum of distant servers and the soft click of my keyboard. I stood and walked over to the window. The training center lights were off now, chairs tucked in, whiteboard erased. But earlier that day, it had been full of energy. Diagrams drawn, hands raised, laughter exchanged. This, all of it, was never part of some grand revenge. I hadn't plotted Miracore's downfall. I hadn't needed to. They made a decision. So did I. And when that door closed, I didn't knock to be let back in. I simply built another one. A better one. Elaine had asked me once, what do you want all this to lead to? I didn't have an answer then. But maybe now I did. Legacy. The kind with plaques or titles. But the kind that lives in others. Systems that last, lessons that spread, people who build with care because they were taught that way. As I turned off the lights and grabbed my coat, a deep calm settled over me. This chapter wasn't about loss. It was about everything that had come after. A few days later, as I was leaving the building, I noticed a small group gathered in the courtyard. Familiar faces from the old Mira Corps days. They were mid-conversation, but when they saw me, the group quieted. One of them, Priya, stepped forward. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said, "for not turning your back on all of us." I shook my head. "You weren't the ones who made the decision. I knew that." Another engineer, Luis, added, "It's different now. The way things are built, the way teams collaborate, there's trust again. And it's because of how you led this." Their words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. I hadn't realized the full extent of what had shifted. Not just systems and org charts, but culture, mindset, belief. They weren't just grateful for the opportunity to rebuild. They were proud of what we were becoming. Later that night, Elaine handed me an envelope at the dinner table. Inside was a photo, taken years ago, of me sitting in the original Mira Corps server room, wires everywhere, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but focused. "You should frame it," she said. I looked at it for a long time, not to remember where I started, but to honor how far we'd come.
A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a regional tech summit. Nothing flashy, just a panel on sustainable systems design. I almost declined, but Elaine nudged me gently, as she always did. "Go," she said. "Tell them what you've learned." So I did. The room wasn't packed, maybe 50 people. But they listened closely. I spoke not about bleeding-edge technology or disruptive trends, but about the quiet strength of well-built systems, the ones no one notices until they stop working. I told them about failure, what it looked like when leadership ignored foundational work in favor of buzzwords. I told them about what came after, about rebuilding with clarity and care, about putting documentation before delivery, people before pride. And when the talk ended, something unexpected happened. People stayed. They asked thoughtful questions, not about tools, but about values, about mentorship, cross-team trust, the role of humility in architecture. One young woman approached me after. "I thought tech was only for people who move fast and break things," she said. "But now, I'm not so sure." I smiled. Moving fast doesn't mean skipping the blueprint. That night, back on the deck with Elaine, I looked out at the water, calm and sure. It turns out, the most enduring things I'd built weren't lines of code or data pipelines. They were people, conversations, principles, and those don't crash, they multiply.